The cold wind of early dawn bit through the silence at the edge of a narrow forest footpath. The trees whispered among themselves as if they too disapproved of what was about to happen. A woman stood tall and stiff, her grip tight around the wrist of a small, trembling girl. The child's eyes were swollen from sleep, her bare feet muddy from the long walk, her little dress torn and stained with dirt. But her voice, oh, her voice, it still had a flicker of strength, of innocence that hadn't yet been smothered. "Please, Auntie Sandra, where are we going?" she asked, her tone barely more than a breath against the howling wind. Sandra didn't answer. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes cold, her soul far removed from the frightened child at her side. The tall grass in front of them parted just enough to reveal a small pit dug into the wet earth, shallow, freshly turned, buzzing with flies. The smell of damp soil was sharp and sour in the air. Without a word, Sandra shoved the girl forward. "Auntie, no! Please, please!" the girl screamed, panic rising in her voice as she stumbled backward, trying to resist. But her small legs weren't strong enough. One final push and she tumbled into the pit, hitting the ground with a sharp yelp. "Wait!" she sobbed, trying to stand, but her legs gave out under her. "Please don't leave me. I'll be good. I promise." But Sandra was already turning. Her footsteps disappeared into the trees. She didn't look back. And just like that, the forest swallowed its secret. 5 days earlier, that same girl, Heleliana, had been a joyful 5-year-old living in a small home that always smelled faintly of burning firewood and old sadness. Her mother, Amara, had died during childbirth. Her father, Jonathan, had poured every ounce of love he had into raising her. He quit his job, stayed home, learned to braid her hair, to cook her favorite meals, to be both father and mother. In their town, people called him the man with 2 hearts. But time isn't kind to men who wear love so plainly. "You need to remarry," his family would say. "Heleliana needs a mother figure. You need a woman beside you." For years, Jonathan resisted. He couldn't imagine another woman stepping into the sacred space Amara once occupied. But then he saw how lonely Heleliana was playing alone with worn-out dolls, staring at other children holding their mother's hands. Slowly, he gave in. And that's when Sandra came. She was beautiful, polished, soft-spoken. People called her the angel, and Jonathan, hungry for companionship, trusted too quickly. When he introduced her to Heleliana, she knelt down, smiled sweetly, and said, "I will love her like my own." Jonathan believed her. He wanted to believe her. For the first few months, things seemed perfect. Sandra bought Heleliana new shoes. She helped braid her hair. She even read her bedtime stories. Jonathan was overjoyed. He thought the hole in their home had finally been patched. But behind Sandra's smiles was a mind still listening to the wrong voices. "You're too soft," her friends whispered. "Why are you raising another woman's child? Let her father handle her. This is your time to enjoy your marriage." And, like slow-working poison, those words started changing her. It began with a tone shift. "Why are your toys all over the floor? Clean them up before Daddy comes home." Then, harsher words. "You call this clean? Do it again." Then came the early morning chores, the punishments, the cold stares. But Heleliana never complained, not to her father, not to the neighbors, not even to her toys. She loved Jonathan too much. She didn't want to worry him, so she swallowed it. Every cold word, every slap of silence, every glare like ice. The morning of the pit came fast. Jonathan had left for work at 4:30 a.m., kissing Sandra on the cheek, then Aleliana on the forehead. "Be good, my sunshine," he whispered before stepping into the still dark street. At 5:00 a.m., Sandra crept into Ileliana's room. "Get up," she said, shaking the child roughly. She tossed a worn, hand-woven dress onto the bed. "Wear this." "No shoes." "Where are we going?" Ileliana asked, blinking, confused. "You'll see." They walked in silence through damp grass, narrow footpaths, past sleeping houses and whispering trees until the forest swallowed them whole. And then it happened. Sandra shoved her into the pit and left. For the first hour, Aleliana screamed until her voice cracked. Then she sobbed, then whispered, and finally she just lay there, curled up in the dirt, shivering. She didn't know how to process betrayal that big. She didn't even know what betrayal was, but her body knew. 3 days passed. No food, no water. Her lips cracked. Her belly gnawed at itself. Her tiny fingers clawed at the earthen walls of her grave. Birds flew overhead. Lizards darted past. She called for her father, but no one came. On the 5th day, fate blinked. A black SUV rolled to a stop on a roadside not far from the forest. George Royce, a tall man in a tailored black suit, stepped out, grumbling something about needing to pee. His security team offered to follow, but he waved them off. "Just a quick one," he muttered. He walked into the bush, zipped up, turned to leave, then paused. Was that a voice? "Please, help." Frowning, he listened harder. It was faint, broken, barely human. He moved carefully through the trees, parting tall grass until he saw it a small hand, fingers twitching, a face half buried in the dirt, eyes barely open. "Oh, dear God," he breathed. He whipped out his phone. "Dr. Mecca! Ambulance! Now!" Within minutes, the forest exploded into motion. His medic team raced in, lifted the frail child gently, placed her in the back of the vehicle, and began resuscitation. George Royce stood frozen, staring. A billionaire who had dined with presidents, closed billion-naira deals, but nothing had shaken him like this. A little girl left for dead in a shallow grave. Something inside him cracked. "She's not going back," he said firmly. "Not to wherever she came from." They sped toward Abuja. The doctors weren't hopeful. "She may not survive the night," they warned. But Aleliana was stronger than they knew. When she opened her eyes, a bright light filled the hospital suite. A woman with warm eyes and soft hands stood beside her, brushing a cool cloth across her forehead. "My name is Cynthia," she whispered. "You're safe now, sweetheart." And for the first time in her life, Aleliana asked a question she had never dared to speak aloud. "Can I stay with you?" Cynthia nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, my love. From today, you are ours." George stepped in from the corner, where he had been watching quietly, his powerful frame somehow gentle now. He knelt beside her and placed a hand on her tangled hair. "You're not just safe," he said. "You're home." Aleliana didn't remember much about the night she was rescued. Only the scent of clean linen, the cold sting of IV needles, and the warmth of a hand brushing her hair. When she woke, the light was soft, filtered through wide windows. The sheets were white. The walls were pale lavender. There was no pit, no damp soil, no buzzing flies. She was wrapped in a blue pajama set that smelled like sunshine and detergent. Sitting beside her was the same woman who had whispered gently to her when she first opened her eyes. Cynthia. Her voice was low, careful, like it had been trained not to scare birds or frighten children. She read bedtime stories with a rhythm that slowed the heartbeat, sang lullabies that didn't ask for anything in return. When she stroked Aleliana's head and whispered, "You are loved," the child blinked in disbelief. George Royce rarely spoke during those early days. He sat across the room, mostly silent, watching. But when he did speak, his words landed like stones in the still water. "You don't owe us anything," he said once. "Just be a child." Aleliana didn't know what to do with that sentence. No one had ever told her she didn't owe them something. Her appetite returned slowly. Her nightmares came faster. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pit. She felt the push. She heard the trees closing in. And sometimes, just before waking, she heard her own voice screaming, "Please don't leave me." But in this new home, her screams did not echo into nothing. Cynthia would come running, hold her tight, and whisper again, "You're safe now. You're not underground anymore." The day they brought her home from the hospital, Aleliana expected a small house with creaky doors and patched walls. Instead, she entered a mansion that looked like it had fallen out of a fairy tale. Marble floors gleamed under her feet. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling. Chandeliers sparkled above her head like stars trying to impress her. But what caught her attention wasn't the architecture or the richness. It was the room they gave her. Her room. Painted soft purple. A closet full of new clothes. Stuffed animals that didn't have missing eyes. A bed she could roll across without falling off. And then there was Maxwell. He came barreling down the hallway when she arrived, full of energy and grinning like mischief in human form. He stopped in front of her and held out his hand with pride. "I'm Max," he said. "I hope you like Spider-Man. I got 3 lunch boxes with him on it." Aleliana blinked. For a moment, she didn't understand. No child had ever introduced themselves like that before. No child had ever wanted her to be their friend. She took his hand. Days turned into weeks. Weeks blurred into months. She started school with Maxwell. She was behind in every subject. She didn't know how to spell her own name properly, couldn't read fluently, had never written more than her alphabet. But her mind was a sponge, and she soaked up knowledge with a hunger that made her teachers weep. Cynthia hired private tutors, ballet classes, music lessons, books stacked to the ceiling. Every night she and Maxwell curled up on the rug in the reading room. Her favorite was The Little Match Girl, but she always made Cynthia stop before the ending. "I don't like sad endings," she would say, and Cynthia, smiling, would reply, "Then we'll write a new one." As time passed, Aleliana's laugh returned. The dark hollows under her eyes filled in. Her shoulders no longer flinched at raised voices, but somewhere inside her, a quiet storm still brewed. She never spoke about Sandra, never told George or Cynthia what had happened in the forest. Not yet. One rainy afternoon, while waiting in the back seat of the Royce car for the driver to return from the pharmacy, she stared out the window and whispered a question meant for no one. "Do you think Daddy ever looked for me?" The driver, startled by the sound of her voice, turned halfway. "I'm sorry, Ma." "Nothing," she muttered. But it wasn't nothing. She remembered Jonathan, his tribal marks, the way he laughed when she danced in the sitting room, the way he said sunshine like it was a sacred name. Sometimes she wondered if he knew she was gone, if he had searched, or if Sandra had lied to him too. She pushed those thoughts away, because here, in this mansion, with warm food and loving arms and a best friend who whispered, "It's okay, I'm here," she was not just surviving, she was beginning again. Every time she woke up from a nightmare, Maxwell would pull his blanket over her shoulders and whisper, "You're not in the ground anymore." They became inseparable. In primary school, they shared every class. In high school, they shared every secret. They studied together, argued like siblings, protected each other fiercely. Once, a senior boy insulted a younger student, and Leliana stepped forward without hesitation. "You call him a roach again," she said, "and I will step on you myself." She and Maxwell got suspended for 2 days. When they got home, George tried to scold them, but his lips betrayed a smile. Cynthia only said, "I'm glad you defended someone. Next time, maybe use fewer insect metaphors." But the truth was, Leliana wasn't just defending someone else. She was defending the part of herself that had once been treated worse than a roach, the part that had begged not to be thrown away. One morning, in their final year of secondary school, George entered the dining room holding 2 envelopes. They gleamed gold in the sunlight. "Guess what?" he said, waving them. "What's that?" Leliana asked. "You both got accepted. Same university, same course, same dorm." "Medicine." Maxwell whooped. Cynthia screamed. Leliana blinked. Her throat tightened. She looked at the letters, and then at George, and then at her reflection in the polished glass of the dining room. She had done it. The girl from the pit. The one who was thrown away. The one who was never supposed to live. She was going to medical school. That night, she sat at her window, wrapped in a robe, watching the stars bleed silver onto the sky. Her heart was loud in her chest, but her voice was quiet. She whispered one word: "Thank you." She didn't know who she was thanking. George, maybe. God, perhaps. Or maybe the small voice inside her that never gave up, that screamed even when no one was listening, that clawed at the sides of a pit and refused to die. She closed her eyes. She was not in the ground anymore. She was Leliana Royce. She was rising. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and freshly brewed coffee. Leliana had just finished her morning rounds, her white coat crisp, her ID badge swinging slightly as she moved from room to room. She was calm, efficient, respected. Nurses nodded at her with admiration. Patients smiled in relief when she entered. She had built a reputation over the past year, not just as a skilled doctor, but as someone who listened. It had been years since the pit. Years since Cynthia braided her hair and Maxwell shoved a Spider-Man lunchbox into her arms. Now she was Dr. Leliana Royce, not a survivor, a healer. She was halfway through reviewing patient files when her fingers stopped. A name stared back at her from the top of the page. Her blood turned to ice. Sandra Jonathan. For a moment, she thought it was a mistake, a cruel coincidence, but the details screamed otherwise. Female, late 50s, partial blindness, suspected ocular tumor, emergency prep for surgery. Her hands began to shake. A knock on her office door snapped her out of the trance. A nurse stepped in, looking nervous. "Doctor," she said gently, "the patient's family member is here. He's asking to speak with you before we take her in." Leliana stood up slowly. Her mouth was dry. She walked down the hall like someone dreaming. Each step echoed louder than the last. When she turned the corner, she saw him, Jonathan. Older now, tired. His once proud frame slightly hunched, eyes hollowed out by time and sadness. The same tribal marks carved into his cheeks, the same familiar scent of old cologne and earth. He looked up and their eyes met. He froze. Something passed through his face, shock, disbelief, something like grief trying to become joy. "Yes," she whispered, voice caught in her throat. Are you Jonathan Oena? His knees gave out before he could speak. He dropped to the floor, hands clutching the bottom of her coat like it was a holy cloth. My daughter, he sobbed. My daughter, I thought you died. Sandra told me you were taken, that you disappeared, that no one could find you. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Her whole body trembled. She wanted to yell, to ask why, to say nothing. Jonathan looked up at her, broken. She's the patient, he whispered. Sandra, please, please save her life. For a moment, everything inside her went quiet. The woman who had pushed her into a pit now lay on an operating table, her life depending on the hands of the child she had tried to erase. The nurse returned. Doctor, she said softly, the patient's fading, if we don't prep now. Aleliana inhaled. Slowly, her voice came out level, clinical, like a mask had fallen over her pain. I'll be there. In the scrub room, she stared at herself in the mirror. Mask around her neck, surgical gown tied tight, her eyes were sharp, determined, but inside them was something else, something older than pain. She pulled the mask up and walked into the operating theater. Machines beeped, monitors flashed. Sandra lay pale and unconscious on the table, the curve of her mouth slack, hair now graying at the edges. She looked fragile, human. The same hands that once shoved a child into a pit now rested limp under white sheets. The nurse glanced over. Vitals steady. Aleliana nodded. Her voice was steady. Begin the incision. The surgery took hours. It was complex, risky, delicate. Her fingers moved with practiced precision. Not once did they tremble. She removed the tumor, stitched the wound, stabilized the bleeding. When it was done, she stepped back, took one last look at the woman on the table, and whispered so quietly only she could hear, You don't deserve it, but I swore to save lives, not choose them. Then she left the room, collapsing onto a chair in the hallway, her breath coming in short bursts. George found her there, his tie loose, eyes filled with worry. I just got the call, he said. Are you okay? She looked at him. She's alive, she said simply. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He sat beside her in silence. 2 days later, Sandra woke up. Her vision was blurry, her head heavy, the light in the room dim. Across from her sat a woman in a white coat. At first, she didn't recognize her, but then she did. Her breath caught. Aleliana, she croaked. Aleliana leaned forward, eyes like fire behind glass. 17 years ago, she said quietly, you took me to a forest. You pushed me into a pit. You left me to die. Sandra's hands trembled. No, that's not true. It is, and you know it. Sandra turned away, covering her face with both hands. I was young, she sobbed. Foolish. Your father and I had just married. I was scared. I didn't know what I was doing. You didn't care if I lived or died. Sandra cried harder. I'm sorry. I swear. I regret everything. I didn't come here for your apology, Aleliana said, standing. Then why? To let you know I saved your life, because I'm a doctor, because I took an oath, even for people like you. She paused at the door. But I won't pretend I'm okay. I won't pretend this didn't scar me. Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. Can you forgive me? Aleliana turned slightly. Her eyes were unreadable. I can't forget, and I'm not ready to forgive. Outside, Jonathan waited in the corridor. He stood up when she came out, face wet with tears. "My sunshine," he whispered. "I didn't know. If I did—" "I know," she said quietly. "I believe you. Do you hate me?" She shook her head. "I never did." He broke into sobs, pulling her into a trembling hug. "You're so grown, so beautiful. I missed everything. Your birthdays, your first words, your dreams." She closed her eyes. "But you never stopped loving me. That's why I forgave you." Back at the Royce mansion, Maxwell sat at the dining table, spinning a pen in his fingers. When Aleliana walked in, he stood up. "Well?" he asked. She lived. "And you?" She paused. "I'm still learning how to live." He gave her a side hug. "That's okay," he said. "Just don't forget how far you've come." Aleliana looked around the place that once felt too perfect to belong to her. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. But deep inside, something had shifted. She had faced her past, but the future was already waiting, full of questions she never thought she'd ask. Because the story was not over. Not yet. The road to Umua was narrow and cracked, winding between fields of rust-red soil and groves of palm trees that stretched long into the horizon. Aleliana sat quietly in the back seat of the Royce SUV, her forehead resting against the cool glass of the window. Beside her, Maxwell flipped through a dog-eared travel guide, though he wasn't really reading. Neither of them had spoken in over an hour. There was no need. The air between them was heavy enough. 17 years had passed since Aleliana had left this village, dragged through forest paths in the early dawn, her feet bare, her voice begging. And now she was returning, not as the forgotten child of a dead woman, but as a doctor, as a survivor, as a daughter chasing the truth. When they entered the village square, time seemed to fold in on itself. Women were frying akara under tin sheds. Children ran barefoot, kicking plastic bottles like footballs. Elder men sat hunched in a corner, playing checkers on a wooden slab. The air smelled of smoke, oil, and dust. It looked ordinary. But in her chest, Aleliana's heart pounded like a war drum. "This is where she grew up," she whispered. Maxwell reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Then let's finish what she started." Their first stop was the home of Mama Ngozi, the village's oldest midwife, a woman said to have helped deliver half the community. She was nearly blind now, her eyes clouded by time, but her memory remained as sharp as cut glass. When Mama Ngozi saw Aleliana standing at the threshold of her clay house, she blinked once, leaned forward on her cane, and gasped. "Amara?" Aleliana shook her head slowly. "I'm her daughter." Tears sprang to the old woman's eyes. "You look just like her." They sat in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. "Please, Mama," Aleliana finally said. "I need to know what really happened between my mother and Sandra, between her and my father. I need to understand why someone would want me dead." Mama Ngozi sighed. Her voice trembled with both age and pain. "It was never just about love, child. It was about land, about power." Aleliana's breath caught. "Land?" The old woman nodded. "Your mother, Amara, was the only child of Chief Obina Ume, the village's last ruling elder. When he died suddenly and without warning, she inherited everything. Farmland, palm oil plantations, 15 plots of land across Umua. She was rich, respected, and beautiful. Jonathan loved her truly, but he wasn't the only one who had eyes on her legacy. Maxwell leaned forward. What happened after she died? Mom Ngozi closed her eyes. That's when the vultures came. She explained it slowly, like peeling back layers of an old wound. After Amara's death, Jonathan was devastated. He stopped working. He mourned hard. But while he grieved, his extended family began to circle. They saw opportunity in his sorrow. The inheritance was in Amara's name, but as long as Aleliana was alive, no one could touch it. She was the legal heir. They needed a way to erase your claim, the old woman said, and they did it through marriage. Aleliana felt the breath leave her lungs. You mean Sandra wasn't just a stepmother? She was planted. Her family had ties to local politicians. When she married Jonathan, everything started to change. Legal documents were altered, property titles rewritten. Her name appeared on land that used to belong to your mother. Maxwell clenched his jaw. And Aleliana? You were the final loose end. As long as you lived, someone could challenge the documents. So they got rid of you. Aleliana sat frozen. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt. The pit hadn't been a crime of passion. It had been a strategy, a cold, calculated move to erase her, to rewrite a legacy. And no one said anything? She whispered. Mama Ngozi looked away. We were scared. Sandra's family had friends in the council. Even the police looked the other way. We saw what happened to those who questioned them. Tears slipped down Aleliana's cheeks, not from weakness, but from fury. She had thought her story was one of abandonment, but it was theft, murder, masked in silence. Was anything left? She asked. Anything still in my mother's name? The old woman nodded and rose slowly, walking to an old shelf in the corner of the room. She returned with a faded brown envelope, sealed and fraying at the edges. Your mother gave this to me, she said softly. Just a week before she gave birth, she told me, if anything happens to me, give this to my daughter. Aleliana opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a will, official, stamped, signed, and on it, every property, every piece of land was left to her. Maxwell leaned over her shoulder, breath caught. It's real. Tears ran freely down her face now. Her mother had known. She had prepared. Even in death, she had left Aleliana the truth. That night, back in Abuja, George called in his legal team. The case was opened. The documents were verified. The news spread like wildfire. A young doctor had returned to reclaim her legacy. The court ruled swiftly. Every property transferred after Amara's death was declared fraudulently handled. The deeds were restored to their rightful heir, Dr. Aleliana Jonathan. Newspapers called it a miracle. Others called it justice. But to Aleliana, it was neither. It was restoration. And it was not enough. She returned to Umua one final time, standing at the edge of the forest where she had once begged for water from the bottom of a shallow grave. The pit was gone now, overgrown with weeds, but the ghosts were still there. She stood in white, silent, and placed a plaque in the ground. This ground could have ended me, but I rose from it instead. Beside her stood Jonathan, George, Cynthia, and Maxwell. Her father wept. George held her hand. Maxwell, quietly, asked, "What now?" Aleliana looked up at the sky, her voice steady. "Now we build. We heal. We teach every girl like me that being thrown away does not mean you are worthless." And for the first time, the earth beneath her feet felt like it belonged to her. The TED stage in Abuja was soaked in light. The room was packed with journalists, doctors, students, and leaders from across the continent. Cameras rolled, microphones glowed red. But when Aleliana stepped forward in her white coat, embroidered with Dr. Aleliana Jonathan, the crowd fell silent. She stood tall, a woman who once had no voice, now holding the attention of a continent. "I was 5 years old," she began, "when I was pushed into a shallow pit and left to die." Gasps echoed softly through the hall. "I wasn't supposed to survive. I wasn't supposed to speak again, or walk, or love, or rise. But here I am." Applause broke, then fell quiet again as she continued. "I used to think survival was enough, that if I made it out, if I built a life, if I succeeded, then the past would dissolve. But healing," she paused, "is not forgetting. It's choosing peace while still carrying the scar." Her voice trembled only once, but her hands stayed firm on the podium. "There are girls right now, like the one I was. Girls who are told their mistakes. Girls who are thrown away, not just by people but by systems, by silence, by shame. And I want them to know, you are not a burden. You are the future." When she stepped away from the mic, the hall erupted in a standing ovation. Cynthia was crying in the front row. George had tears in his eyes. Maxwell clapped so hard his palms turned red. That speech went viral within days. "From Pit to Purpose" became one of the most watched videos across Africa. Invitations flooded in from schools, governments, NGOs. Aleliana had become a voice, not just for herself, but for generations silenced before her. But even as she stood in spotlights, there was one shadow still left. One question. One door she hadn't dared open. Why did her mother die? The official story had always been complications during childbirth. But after her return to Umua, after the lawsuit, after the restoration of land and title, whispers had begun to surface. Whispers that something had been hidden. One evening, after an outreach event for orphaned girls, Maxwell sat beside her on the balcony of the Royce mansion. "You're not sleeping again," he said gently. She nodded. "It's back." "The pit?" She shook her head. "No, this time it's her. My mother." He turned toward her, listening. "There's something missing," Aleliana said. "Sandra confessed why she hated me. But she never said how my mother really died, and I think she knew." Maxwell didn't interrupt. She was afraid at the end, not just of death, of being exposed. "So," he said carefully, "what are you going to do?" She looked out at the sky. "I'm going back." Days later, she stood again in Umua, but this time not at the forest. This time at the small abandoned clinic where her mother had once been brought for labor. The building was falling apart. Ivy crawled across broken windows. The air was thick with dust. But in the back room, behind a rusted cabinet, Aleliana found what she was looking for. An old logbook. She flipped through the yellowed pages, hands trembling. Then she found it. Amara Jonathan. Admitted 3:17 a.m. Complications noted. Uterine bleeding. Requested referral to Federal Hospital. Referral denied. No ambulance available. Doctor on call. F. Okiki. Aleliana blinked. Her heart thudded. She knew that name. Dr. Felix Okiki. Retired now. Former chief medical officer. A family friend of Sandra's father. She tracked him down. He lived in Enugu now, in a quiet gated house with a dog named Simba and a memory that had not faded. When he opened the door and saw her, he flinched. "Dr. Jonathan," he said slowly, "I was wondering when you'd come." Inside, over bitter tea, she asked him only one question. "Did my mother have to die?" He stared into his cup for a long time. "No." Silence. "She needed a transfusion," he continued. "It was available at the regional hospital, less than 20 kilometers away. I had the referral ready." "Then why didn't she get it?" "Because I was told to delay, told she'd be fine, told it was politically sensitive, told by people I shouldn't have listened to." Aleliana sat motionless. "You let her bleed to death?" He nodded. "Not because I wanted to, because I was afraid." "Of what?" He looked up at her, eyes full of a decades-old ache. "Of the people who sent Sandra into your father's life. They were powerful. They didn't want Amara to live. Her death cleared the way for everything that followed." Aleliana stood up. Her body shook, not with rage, not with grief, with clarity. Everything made sense now. Her mother hadn't died because of birth complications. She had been allowed to die. The same hands that tried to bury a child had first erased a mother. Back in Abuja, she stood before her foundation board. "We are expanding," she said. "Not just with schools or scholarships, but with investigations, legal aid, for women whose stories were never told, for the mothers who didn't make it, for the daughters who survived anyway." Months later, the Amara Legacy Foundation opened its first legal office for maternal justice and hospital reform. Aleliana returned once more to Umua. At the center of the village stood a new statue, Amara, carved from white marble, holding a baby in one arm and a book in the other. The base read, "She bled so others could rise." Jonathan stood beside his daughter, hands shaking as he read the words. "She would be proud of you." Aleliana looked toward the sky. "I hope so." Maxwell took her hand. "She is." And beneath that same sky where she was once forgotten, Aleliana stood, not as a victim, not as a daughter of pain, but as the voice of thousands. The girl who was thrown into a pit had become the one building ladders for others to climb out.